controversial title. I don't think it's that controversial compared with a book, for example, that you might publish with a title like The God Delusion. Slightly provocative, but nonetheless it's our own attempt to be slightly provocative, and I hope it's not upset anyone, as it did yesterday. If it has, apologies. A slightly toned down title of the same talk would be Does Science Disprove God? It's that kind of question, but with maybe getting the offensive a little bit later as well. To the question, does science disprove God? I would have said once, yes. Obviously, I'm not going to say that tonight, which will reassure the Christian Union who invited me. But I would have once said yes. In fact, as an 18-year-old, going up to Cambridge to study science, I held Christianity in some contempt. And I even wrote a poem to express my thoughts about Christianity. Now, you've got to understand that I was a science student, not an English student, and so my poem has limited literary merit. However, I still remember it, and I'm going to share it with you now. Some folks seem to find it odd that people grow from tiny cells. Pathetic, those who think of God and still drop coins in wishing wells. Okay, there we are, that's it. That was my literary thinking of. But in some ways, it's something of my opinion of Christianity. Clearly, people mustn't understand the very basics of biology. Sure, people used to think that God gave life, but now we understand about cell division and DNA and that kind of thing. People used to think that it rained because God had a big watering can in the sky. But then someone figured out evaporation and condensation in the water cycle, and we can explain it. People used to think that people got healed of diseases by magic, but then we understood about bacteria and antibodies, and we understand we can explain it. And people who still cling to ideas of science in the face of all that, ideas of God, in the face of all that, they must just not understand biology and be superstitious and naive. Much like people who throw their spare change into water, down a well, make a wish, and honestly expect tomorrow to turn out differently because of it. That was my view of Christianity in my first year at university, until about a month later, I became a Christian. It's a long story. I met some Christians at Cambridge who didn't fit my stereotype of stupid, prejudiced people. They were intelligent people, and they were people whose lives I admired as they lived out their faith in Jesus. And the people who got me thinking, and to cut a long story short, I became convinced of Christianity. But I'm still a scientist. I managed to complete my degree and then went on to do a PhD in neuroscience, which sounds glamorous until I confess to you that what it actually involved was I was studying the way in which the brain integrates the signals from the left and the right ear when they come together. But that basically involves sitting in a soundproof room listening to about 20,000 clicks and classifying them. So most PhDs come down to something a bit like that. One of my friends, his brother, did a PhD in chemical engineering sponsored by Hovis that involved looking at electron micrographs of bread and circling and counting the bubbles. So, at least I thought that some people have it even worse than I did. But that was my contribution to science, and yet now doing my science as a committed Christian, believing as I explored the intricacies of the human auditory system, which really is quite incredible, and I can tell you all about it for hours if you want to know afterwards. But believing I was studying the handiwork, the design of a God who lovingly given us the ability to hear. Still doing science, but now as a Christian. Previously doing science and being an atheist, now doing science and being a Christian. And actually in quite good company. I wasn't an oddball in the sense of combining those two things. I remember the first Sunday I went to church in Cambridge, having become a Christian, sitting next to and discovering that the old guy with the beard next to me was the professor of geophysics at the university, Bob White. And then I discovered that my best Christian friend in college, who was doing geology, his supervisor, his tutor, was the professor of paleontology, Professor Conway Morris, who was also a Christian. Which was surprising to me, because people say, don't they, that because of the fossils and the dating of the earth and how the Bible's got that wrong, you couldn't possibly be a serious geologist and a Christian. But actually, Professor Conway Morris and Professor White know more about geology than most people on the planet. And yet in their case, they're committed Christians. Doesn't seem to be the case of a straight either or, science or Christianity. In fact, many of the scientists of the past, those who got science started, were committed believers in God. Maybe you recognise some of these names and can tell me what they do. Just a little test here. What did they discover? So start with an easy one. Michael Faraday. Maybe not that easy. Electricity, discovered electricity. These are an easy one. Isaac Newton. Gravity, amongst other things. Yeah, gravity. James Clerk Maxwell, harder one. Astronomy, explanatory motion, that kind of thing. Robert Boyle, those annoying Boyle's gas laws you had to learn if you did level chemistry, so I've now forgotten. Charles Babbage, you want to know that one? The difference engine, yeah, which is sometimes credited as being an early kind of computer, or at least some of the same ideas of computation. Louis Pasteur, who discovered the bacteria. All of them scientists, eminent scientists, and at the same time, Christians. In fact, interestingly, according to the eminent historian and philosopher of science, Sir Alfred North Whitehead, it was because of their belief in a designer God that man became scientific in the first place. This is how he puts it. Man became scientific because he looked for law in nature. And he looked for law in nature because he believed in a lawgiver. In other words, it was because people were convinced that there was a God who designed and ordered the world intelligently that they thought it was worth trying to understand the world and explain it. If modern science, if people had believed 200, 300 years ago, as many do today, that the world is entirely accidental, random, it's questionable whether they would have bothered to find it intelligible in the first place. They wouldn't have expected to find explanation. So scientists of the past, scientists of the present, are Christians. Of course, there are atheists of the past and atheists of the present who are scientists as well. But it doesn't seem to be a straight either or, science or Christian. There's just too many counterexamples to that. That is, of course, unless you cheat in the way that you set up the experiment. Let me explain what I mean. Imagine I were to make a machine capable of detecting visible light. And it's got a prism inside, so it breaks light into the different component wavelengths, from red light on one hand all the way through to blue light on the other. And I have a series of photodetectors inside, all the way along the visible spectrum, from red to blue. But because I'm only making a visible light detector, I don't bother to put any detectors in beyond the visible spectrum. Okay, you come to me and you say, hey Andrew, I think I've discovered this thing called infrared light. I think that's how the remote control works on the telly. Oh, very interesting, I say. Let me test it with my machine. So I take the remote control, I point it at my machine, I press the button, it registers nothing, and I say to you, infrared light does not exist. Well, that would be a foolish conclusion, because if I've set up my apparatus only to be sensitive to measuring visible light, I can't use that apparatus to exclude the possibility of something it wasn't set up to discover or measure in the first place. Let me explain where this goes. If you want to define science naturalistically, such that the only kind of results or experiments that you count as being scientific are those which rule out the possibility of God and the supernatural, well then of course the science defined by that will only ever produce results that are defined by the absence of God and the supernatural. But that's because if you put naturalism in, you'll get naturalism out. You've just cheated in the way you set up the experiment. I want to suggest that if we're more objective about how we define science, if we take it as a system of inquiry by which we observe the world, formulate a hypothesis to describe what we observe, test that hypothesis by experiment, and then accept or reject it as the scientific method, then I know nothing about that method, nor results that have been found by that method, that disprove or discredit the idea of the Christian God. I just don't think that if you are objective about science, it gives you that dichotomy, science or God. I just don't think it's that simple. However, very clearly there is a conflict in our world. There is a war raging. If you've read Richard Dawkins, if you've heard the debates on the radio, you will know that. You'll know it's an enormously contentious area. But I want to suggest today, this is the most important thing I think I'm going to say tonight, I want to suggest that the debate isn't between science, the institutions, the results of science on the one hand, and Christianity, but rather between two different philosophies, two different positions, with science somewhere in the middle, two different positions of philosophy, or let me be slightly controversial, two different positions of faith. I know Richard Dawkins would be very upset to hear me describe his position as a faith position, but it is interesting as you read a book like The God Delusion, just how many times he says something like, I believe that, or I cannot believe that such and such, without giving any scientific data in support. And I'll give a specific example of that a little bit later on. Two different philosophers, two different worldviews with which people hold and come to the science that are diametrically opposed. And what I propose to do in the time that we have remaining is to outline those two positions, those two belief systems, and then do what any responsible scientist should do and ask which one makes most sense of the evidence. So here they are. There's other belief systems beside these two. You could be a Muslim, or a Hindu, or Buddhist. I'm not going to discuss these, but for now I'm discussing just these two. Naturalism, which is the worldview of someone like Richard Dawkins, and Christianity, which is the worldview of Jesus Christ. So naturalism, on the one hand, naturalism is the philosophy that says that matter and chance is all that there is. And that is all that there is. So, for example, Carl Sagan, the cosmologist, in a parody of the Bible statement that God was and is to come, Carl Sagan said, no, the cosmos was and is to come. All there's ever been, all there ever will be, is just the cosmos. No God, no transcendent being, just the matter that makes up the world. Or in the words of Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher, mankind is nothing but a chance collocation of atoms on a minor speck of interstellar dust. Sounds slightly depressing. But in a bid to outdo him, perhaps, for depressingness, here is Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist. The French can always slightly outdo us, can't we, in terms of sombre wording. This is what Jean-Paul Sartre says. Every living being was born without reason, prolongs itself out of weakness, and dies by chance. Or, in the words of Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate, who works now in the area of neuroscience, my own discipline, this is what he says. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Those are the important words, no more than. See, I believe, as a Christian neuroscientist, that our thoughts are based in nerve cells and electrons and those kind of things. But for Francis Crick and other naturalists, the world is reducible to that. It is only that. There is nothing beyond the matter that makes us up and the laws of physics that govern it. And that view of naturalism does contrast very starkly with the worldview of the Bible. And rather than give you my own kind of version of Christianity, I want to give it to you in the Bible's own words. And I'm going to take this extract from a speech given by one of Jesus' followers, the Apostle Paul, in first century Athens. Athens was the kind of intellectual capital of the day, where people would debate the latest philosophical ideas. And we're told in particular that Paul got speaking to some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Now, I looked up Epicureanism in a dictionary of philosophy, and apparently the Epicureans believed that the gods were so remote as to play no role in human life. And significantly, that there was no survival after death. So in some ways, Epicureanism, the equivalent or the near equivalent of today's naturalism. This is what Paul says, explaining the Christian message into that context. He says this: the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything. From one man he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. He determined the time set for them, at the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek out for him, and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. And he goes on, I'll read a bit later, a bit more. And I wonder if you can see just from that quote that in fact naturalism and Christianity aren't just different. In some ways they are the exact opposite of one another. If you said to Richard Dawkins, do you believe in the existence of religion in our world? Do you believe in the existence of a belief in God? He would say, well, of course I do. It's one of the reasons I'm writing my books, to try and stamp it out. But of course I believe in that idea of God. But if you were to say, Richard Dawkins, where does that idea of God come from? He would say, well, that's obvious. Humans invented it. We evolved by chance, our brains became more complicated, we dreamt up the idea of God. But Paul is saying, Jesus' follower Paul is saying, that actually it's the exact opposite of that. Do you believe in human beings? Yes. Where did human beings come from? Well, God dreamt them up. God invented them. Richard Dawkins, God is human's invention. The Bible, mankind, is God's invention. Almost exactly the opposite view. And what I want to do in the remaining time, as I said, is to compare the two of them to ask which one makes most sense. I'm going to compare them in three different ways. Firstly, which one makes most sense of design. I use that word advisedly, I'll explain in a moment. Secondly, which one makes most sense of human life. Thirdly, which one makes most sense of Jesus Christ. So let's go. Firstly, design. Now this is a very controversial word, as you know, but everyone at least agrees that the universe looks as though it was designed. The astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle once famously likened the idea of random chance coming up with the kind of complex life that we see in this room as being a bit like saying that the whirlwind passed through a junkyard and came out with a fully assembled 747 by accident. This doesn't seem very likely. But according to naturalists such as Richard Dawkins, design is just an illusion that our genes have played on us. Just a trick. He says this in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, which was on my reading list, required reading for me when I went up to university, kind of a predecessor of the Lord's delusion. He says this, design, he puts it in inverted commas to show his contempt for the idea, design is only apparent. We have a mechanism to account for it, natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process, which we now know is the reason for the existence of and apparently purposeful form for life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind. No vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is that of the blind watchmaker. And that's the title of this book. Now, in other words, the world wasn't really designed, it was just accidental over a period of many years with natural selection, but giving the impression to us, the apparent form, that the world was designed. Christianity disagrees. The God who made the world and everything in it, who gives to all men life and breath and everything. So which one makes most sense of that? Now, I'm deliberately going to avoid the question of evolution, for the reason that Christians differ on it. There'll be Christians in the CU who believe in evolution as a mechanism that God used to make the world, and Christians in the CU who won't agree with that and think that we've got the science wrong, and I don't want to prejudice one view over the other. I'm going to make an argument entirely independent of what you think about evolution, which is to say that even for evolution to get started, you have to have an astonishingly complex molecule, self-replicating molecule of DNA, or at the very least RNA. By no means clear how RNA came about by chance in the first place. Well, people have guessed that maybe it self-assembles due to some kind of catalytic process, and it just happens by chance to be there. But actually the problems start further back than that, because in order to just have it appear and be there, you still have to have a planet with chemicals on it for it to be able to fall. And actually that is where the problems really start. Because the physicists tell us that even to have any kind of cosmos, of the kind that we live in, the numbers become very, very small. Very, very unlikely. Let me give you just one example. Let me take the Big Bang theory and the view of inflation, which is the view that most physicists hold about the very beginning of the Big Bang. Alan Guth, not a Christian, the author of this view of inflation, he explains that at the very beginning of the universe, the expansion rate at the Big Bang has to be exactly correct. If the universe expanded too quickly, then all you would have is hydrogen atoms, the smallest elements, each one separated by millions of miles of vacuum. Just a few protons scattered around the universe, that's all. They never condense into stars, you never have anything more complicated than hydrogen. On the other hand, if the universe expanded too slowly, then gravity would get the better of it and it would collapse back on itself. You'd have a big bang and then a big crunch, a universe, then no universe at all, even before you got 1 nanosecond on your stopwatch. To have any kind of universe of the kind that we inhabit, with stuff more complicated than hydrogen, that lasts for longer than a nanosecond, the expansion rate has got to be extraordinarily finely tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 56 or so. Now that is a very, very small number. Just to give you an analogy, if this will help, cover America with coins, 5-penny pieces, and stack them all the way to the moon, some hundreds of thousands of kilometres away. Then do the same for 1 billion other continents the same size. Paint one of the coins red, blindfold your girlfriend or your boyfriend, get him to pick one at random. If he picks the red one, that's about 1 in 10 to the 40, and he'll get it right. In other words, very, 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 I could keep going, very unlikely. Just to have a universe at all, in which you can have any molecules, including DNA, and get evolution started. Very improbable. Now that is not just an argument, kind of a secret Christian argument. This is a problem that all scientists know about, the so-called fine-tuning of the universe, which Dawkins even discusses it in his book. But naturalists trying to explain that the improbability of the universe, well, they've got an explanation which is increasingly being offered, which is to say that we live in a multiverse. Infinitely many universes, all existing simultaneously. And the idea is that if you throw the dice enough times, eventually your number will come up, however unlikely it might be. So infinitely many universes means that very, very improbable things will happen somewhere. And it basically eliminates your problem of unlikeliness. Well, I just want to notice at this point that the multiverse is not an observable or a testable theory. And as such, I don't think it really can be, in the strict sense of the word, really be called a scientific theory. At least that was the comment made in the review in Nature, the preeminent scientific journal. It's not really science, it's a possible idea to account for the results of science which tell you that the universe is very, 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 very unlikely to exist in this form. But I just want to observe at this point that therefore the multiverse is something that you could believe if you want to, but without scientific data. It's an idea to account for what the science shows you, but really you've got to believe it by faith. And I'm a Christian, I'm doing the same thing. I'm saying that I prefer to believe, I find it easier to believe, that there's a God who made everything. And that is why the numbers are so small. You see, science tells you the numbers, and these two different philosophies have different ideas to account for: a multiverse or a creator God. But notice both of them are faith positions. And I have to say, I think the idea of the multiverse is rather more problematic than the idea of a creator God. Because the multiverse means that everything that's happened in this universe also hasn't happened in another version of the universe. In fact, every single possible universe exists if you put it in infinitely many times. So, as well as the universe when I get to this point in my talk at 5 minutes past 8, there's a universe in which at 5 minutes past 8 and 25 seconds I die. Looks like I'm not in that particular universe today. That's good news for me. Maybe you're thinking not for you. As well as the universe in which I won at the Monopoly 2 weeks ago with a hotel on Park Lane. There's the universe in which my sister won with a hotel on Park Lane. And the universe in which I won with 2 hotels on Park Lane. And so on and so forth for every single possible universe. Everything that you did, you also didn't do in another version of yourself, in another version of the universe. And I think very quickly everything begins to lose meaning. You can't ask the question why, because the answer is just the way it is in this universe, and it isn't in the other one. I find that quite problematic as a philosophy. But it is a position that you could hold if you prefer that to holding the position that God made everything. But I don't think, obviously, the more scientific or the less faith-based design. That's our first thing. Secondly, which one makes most sense of human existence? Now, I want to be careful at this point. Please don't mishear me. Some misheard me yesterday, and it's my fault for not being clear enough, so please listen carefully. I'm not saying that this is an argument why Christianity should be true. Because I don't think that you should believe something to be true simply because it's nicer to believe. No, I'm not arguing that. Rather, this is a question about the livability and the consistency with which you hold your beliefs. I always used to have a problem as a non-Christian with what I saw as the hypocrisy of religion. People who said one thing in church on a Sunday and lived completely a different thing in their lives, secretly and privately. And I found that hypocrisy nauseating. I've said this before in the lunchtime talks. And if you find the same, you're in good company, because Jesus hated it. Jesus hated a mismatch between what we say and what we do. But what I never noticed as I had a go at these Christians was that myself, as an atheist, was guilty of a bigger inconsistency than that. I just wasn't living my life in accordance with the things that I said I believed. So I'd have a go at the Christians, but I never paused to look at the ground I was standing on, to observe and to investigate whether it could bear my weight. Let me explain what I mean. Here's an argument from a book called Straw Dogs by John Gray, apparently Tony Blair's favourite philosopher, which may commend him to you or not, depending on your view of Tony Blair. He was a professor of European thought at the London School of Economics until recently. And in his book Straw Dogs, he chastises naturalists. He's not a Christian himself, but he has to go at naturalists for failing to take their beliefs through to their logical conclusion. This is what he says. Man must accept that his or her existence is entirely accidental. He must realise that, like a gypsy, he lived on a boundary of an alien world, a world that is deaf to his music, and as indifferent to his hopes as it is to his suffering and his crimes. If the world is random, in other words, the world doesn't care about your ambition, it's just random. It doesn't care about your suffering, it's random. It doesn't care about your crimes, it's random. So to push it a bit further, what should somebody who is being consistent as a naturalist say to a mother who's just lost her son in an act of reckless driving by a motorist who knocks him over on his bike down a country lane one night and he dies, as happened to a good one of my mum's best friends? What should my mum say to her friend the mum as a consistent naturalist? I guess unlucky, just the way that the atoms of the universe bumped into one another today. Now, let me say, I don't think for a moment that any naturalist would say that to a grieving mother. At least I hope not, and if you would, please don't ever speak to somebody who's lost somebody. But I don't think anyone would. The naturalists I know are loving people, caring people. They will say something about it being a tragedy and how awful. But I just question that point, whether they're being consistent with their belief. No doubt they justify it by saying it's about sociology and the benefit of being good to one another within the same species. But the trouble is it reduces to something less than the personal. Because sociology is no more than the behaviour of lots of individuals, which is reducible to psychology. Psychology is, well, it's only the behaviour of brains which are collections of atoms and electrons, so it's reducible to biology. And biology, well, they're just complicated chemicals. Proteins are just, more complex forms of simple chemicals. It's just reducible to chemistry. Chemistry is just caused by the way in which different atoms of different size electron shells interact, which is reducible to physics. Physics is reducible to the Big Bang, which happened by chance several billion years ago. And everything that we want to believe in as personal reduces to something that's personal and doesn't care. Sure, sociology, you can believe in it, but it's just a kind of epiphenomenon, just a trick that your DNA's played on you, like design. It doesn't really matter. It's just an accident. As to your suffering, what about for your crimes? When I was doing my PhD, I was always, we used to have coffee together, the kind of lecturers and the PhD students, each morning. And I was always given quite a hard time for being a Christian. In a fun, kind of good-hearted way, we got on pretty well, but they'd always have a go at me for being a Christian. I'm going to tell you about the one conversation that I won. Okay, now I lost most of them. I'm giving the talk, I get to choose which one I share with you. I was talking to a lady called Kate, who's one of the professors, and I said to her, Kate, I don't understand if you're right about the universe, why killing you would be wrong. Let me just say, we got it well. I wasn't contemplating that, but why would killing you be wrong? In particular, why would killing you be any different to cutting a grapefruit in half for my breakfast? All I would be doing in both cases is rearranging the atoms of the universe in a slightly different way. Cake atoms, grapefruit atoms, much the same kind of thing. And she thought about it for a moment. She said, well, my mother would be upset. I said, yes, Kate, but what's upset? Upset is just the change in the concentration of a particular chemical in the randomly assembled collection of atoms which is your mum's brain. Now, I wasn't going to kill Kate, and she wasn't going to kill me, and she cared about right and wrong. She cared about human life and its value. But I questioned whether that was really consistent with what she believed. Now, that was my problem as a naturalist. So I believe this stuff theoretically in the armchair, and it was fun to have a go at the Christians, but maybe that's why you're here. Just for intellectual sport. That's all it was to me, really. But then I began to realise that it didn't hold up the weight of the way I was living. I was being inconsistent. I was being a hypocrite. And that should have been a problem to me. Christians, well, they believe in a God who made the world and everything in it, who gave to all men life and breath and everything. So human life is valuable because it was given by God. It matters. They believe that killing people is wrong because the God who gave life forbade murder. They believe that suffering matters because the God who made a perfect world is grieved at how it's gone wrong. More about that on the Tuesday talk if you want to listen to it and download it. They have a view of the world which I think makes more sense of the way I was living. Now let me just warn us again. I'm not saying we should be Christians because it's a nice thing to believe. I'm just saying that maybe there's a problem in our kind of armchair philosophy if it doesn't actually uphold the lifestyle that we live. We can't live it out consistently. I think that's a problem. Well, thirdly, I want to ask about Jesus Christ. Which worldview makes most sense of Jesus Christ? Paul says in his speech to the Athenians in the first century that God made us and gave us everything in the hope that we might reach out to him and find him, though in fact he's not far from each one of us. And I think that is an absolutely extraordinary thought. I wonder if it's even crossed your mind before. That behind this universe, Christians are not saying there's just a force or some kind of impersonal being or just a first cause. The Bible is saying that behind the universe there is a God who is personal, who made us and wants to know us in a relationship. You know, if you can even get your head around that idea, that there could be such a being as powerful enough to bring all this into being, who at the same time wants to relate to us personally, individually. But at that point, science is out of its depth. It's not that there's anything wrong with science. Science is a very useful thing. It can tell you all kinds of amazing things about the world because of need. But when it comes to getting to know people, science is very limited. Supposing you wanted to get to know me, which maybe as a result of this talk you don't, but maybe you do, and all you had to go on was what you could work out from scientific experiments. So what could you tell? Well, you could do scanning electron microscopy on the fibres on my trousers, and you could work out maybe what kind of sofa I was sitting on, whether you could find any fibres from that, and how many dust mites per square inch there were, and that kind of thing. You could do DNA fingerprinting and compare it with the police database and tell me whether I'm related to any known criminals. Or perhaps determine the likelihood of my dying from some genetic disease before I reach 40. You could do gas chromatography under my armpit and tell me what deodorant I'm wearing and whether or not it's effective in this rather warm lecture theatre under the stress conditions of giving this talk. But that's about all that you could tell. You couldn't tell my name. You couldn't tell what I care about. You couldn't tell who I love. You couldn't tell what makes me happy, what makes me sad, and what I would die for. You couldn't tell almost anything of any importance in terms of relating to me as a person. It's not that science isn't a powerful thing, it's just that science can't tell you everything that's important, which is why I very much doubt, if you were on a date a couple of nights ago, Valentine's Day, I very much doubt that over dinner you said, excuse me, just one question, I wonder if we could have a small blood sample for the DNA tests, and I'll get back to you. Very much doubt that. I very much doubt you make your decision on the basis of scientific experiment. No, you base your decision on getting to know somebody and getting to know their character, whether you can trust them, what they're like. Not using science. Science is important, but you don't do that with science. But actually, the problem with God is even worse than that, isn't it? Because it's hard enough to get to know a person scientifically, but how about a God that you can't even isolate in your test tube to measure? Because he's not material, he's not made of matter. And in fact, if God's everywhere, you can't even exclude him from your test tube to take a null reading as a control. He's just inaccessible to you by that system of inquiry. The only way that we could know the God who made us would be if he decided to reveal himself to us. And the Christian claim we've been looking at all this week is that that is what he has done. The God who made the world and everything in it has revealed himself in history in the man Jesus Christ. Let me just read you the end of Paul's speech to the Athenians. Since we've got offspring, we shouldn't think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. Okay, almost exactly the Richard Dawkins idea that we created God. We shouldn't think that, he says. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to change their minds. For he set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he's appointed. He's given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection, some sneered, others said, we want to hear you again on the subject. Well, those might be the reactions today, I guess. The resurrection of Jesus is offered as, quote, proof of this to all. And that was a surprise to me as a non-Christian. I always thought that science was about facts and religion was about myths. I thought if you want to know about science, you used your brain. If you want to know about religion, you sat in the church with stained glass windows and listened to an organ and see if you could feel moved, which I didn't. I didn't have any time for organs back then. In fact, a little more now. I never realised before that Christianity was about facts. Did this person, Jesus Christ, who lived in Palestine in the 1st century, die? And did he rise from the dead again? If he did, Christianity is true. If he didn't, Christianity is false. And that is a matter of history, which I can begin to look into and explore the evidence for. Great surprise to me that Christianity was not asking you to throw your brain away, leap in the dark based on emotions, but asking me to engage my brain with the evidence that God has given for the resurrection of Jesus. But I have to say that it's when it comes to discussing the resurrection of Jesus that Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, is at its most disappointing, it seems to me. He knows lots about science, he's an eminent biologist, he knows little about Christianity. And it seems, I think, as he discusses the Bible, as he discusses the life of Jesus, he discusses it with the air of somebody who's already made up their minds before they look at the evidence. And so hasn't bothered to research it very thoroughly at all. He says in The God Delusion, no one knows who the 4 gospel writers were, but they almost certainly never met Jesus personally. Which is just wrong, actually. We know from Papias in the early 2nd century and Irenaeus in the early century the names of Matthew and Mark and of John as the authors of the Gospels that bear their names. He says, again, the 4 Gospels that made their way into the official canon were chosen more or less arbitrarily out of a large ensemble of at least a dozen, including the Gospels of Thomas, Peter, Nicodemus, Philip, Bartholomew, and Mary Magdalene. That's the claim you get in the Da Vinci Code if you've read it. It's a novel. It's not the book you should claim you should find in a factual book. Because scholars know that the Gospel of Thomas, for example, is dated to 140 AD, a century after the life of Jesus, whereas the 4 canonical Gospels are dated to the 1st century, within the lifetime of Jesus. And for that reason, those which reflected the eyewitness record at the time were privileged over those written over 100 years later. It's well known to scholarship. But I think Richard Dawkins discusses it, as I say, with the air of somebody who's already made up their mind before they look at the evidence. And that is clear to all when he comes to discuss the resurrection of Jesus. He says only about the resurrection that it either happened or didn't happen, which I agree so far, but then goes on to say that it cannot have happened, being in the very nature of the case a contradiction of the laws of science. But I don't think that's quite right. You see, there's nothing about the scientific method as it observes and explains the world that can exclude an exceptional result. Science is about looking at the exceptional results and asking why, not deciding in advance that they can't happen. Rather, I think, I'd like to paraphrase Dawkins and correct his quotation. And that's to say that the resurrection cannot have happened, being in the very nature of the case a contradiction of my faith in naturalism. See, because if you already hold this view of the world, that we're only matter and chance, that's all that there is. And you hold that view with a blind faith that refuses to look at any counter-evidence. Well, then you come to Jesus and you've already decided you can't be from God because there's no God. You can't have risen from the dead because there is no resurrection. And irrespective of what happened 2,000 years ago, you will still be a naturalist. But I would suggest to you that if you come to the evidence open-minded, just aware of the possibility that there could be a God who made us, And then you will find the evidence for Jesus quite compelling. That there is a God who made the world and everything in it, and that he gives to all men life and breath and everything else. That extraordinarily he wants to know us personally. And so this is much more than a philosophical exercise throwing around ideas. And that one day he will judge the world with justice. More on that tomorrow lunchtime. And of this he's given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Thank you for listening. Well, I've gone over my time, so thank you for your patience with me. And I'm going to hand back over to John.
Are there any questions? How many questions are there roughly, just so we know? Okay, so quite a few. Great. So it would be great if we could keep them relatively brief, and then we could give as many of you an opportunity to ask as well. There was one up there, I think, to start. Yeah.
Why is it that the morality seems to be so attached to Christianity as opposed to, I mean, I don't really understand why 11, 12 would be needed in order to fixate some morality.
Okay, thank you. The question is why I believe that you have to believe in God to believe in some kind of morality. And I don't. So I think that there are people who don't believe in God who hold morals. And some of my good friends who are atheists treat me very well and very kindly. So I don't think that atheists are amoral. My question rather is whether we can explain, whether we're living in a moral kind of way, we can give an account of that is consistent with what we believe about the world. So to go into slightly more detail, two particular problems that arise. How can I explain the personal arising from the impersonal? Why do I think that people matter if my view of things is that really the person is reducible to the impersonal? I'm never any more than the chemicals that compose me. And my impression that I am self-existent or unconscious is an illusion. It's just like my impression that I'm designed is an illusion. I am reducible to the atom. That's Francis Crick's quote. You are no more than your joys, your sorrows, your hopes, your ambitions are no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells. I want to say, I think we are more than that, and I live as though I was more than that. I'm nerve cells, but there is something about personhood which is more than the impersonal that it's comprised of. And a second example would be that we can get conventions of how we do behave from social, just by observing the world. We can say, look, we've evolved as human beings and to not kill each other, we think that's better. And we can describe what is. But there's a great problem in trying to get a morality that doesn't just describe what it is, but what ought to be. And often our morals aren't just a description of what is, but what ought. And that's very difficult to account for just by explanation of the kind of physical world. For example, it is the case that humans kill each other for supremacy. That's a consistent description of human society over its existence, and it makes perfect sense of natural selection. The fittest surviving at the expense of the competitor. And yet somehow we all sit very awkwardly to a kind of genocidal plan of a Hitler. Or a Pol Pot, we think it isn't right, it ought not to be the case that one person should preserve their own race's DNA over another. But it's very difficult to account for that merely from the behaviour that's involved, because that just is the case. All you can say is, well, genetics of some people in Germany in the 30s suggested they should do this, and genetics of some people in the 50s suggest they should do that, and that's just what it is. But all I'm saying is that I don't think I could give an account of that which was consistent with the things that I believed about the world. And that troubled me. I don't think that makes Christianity true. I think for a minute because Christianity is nicer, it must be true. It's more just a question of how comfortable I am with my philosophy of atheism. And I want to suggest that it didn't make sense of the life that I was living. I wasn't being consistent. And that's what made me just want to think again about it.
Do you want to come back quickly on that, or yeah?
I'd like to come back on that.
Okay, yeah, go.
You don't require the fact that you are a collection of cells does not necessarily mean that you have no value. You're the product of 4 billion years of evolution. That's to suddenly take away that existence, that took 4 billion years in creation, not in the physical sense. that does have value. And also, you can construct a morality without the need to account for it through, say, cells or whatever. I have needs, requirements, so I want to be treated in a certain way, I want a certain type of lifestyle. The way to sustain that lifestyle is if other people treat me correctly. The way I will achieve that is if I treat them correctly. You treat others correctly, so it's all the basis of socialism. You get everyone equally and you gain the same treatment.
Sure. I think my opinion is just I don't understand where the value comes from. I don't understand why just time and a blind immaterial process produces personhood and value. I just don't see where that comes in. Because at every stage I'm no more than what I started with. I started with a closed system that had time and space and atoms and laws, and that's all. And then I had lots and lots and lots of time, and I still have a system which is only atoms and space and laws and time. And where did personhood come from? It seems to me still reducible. And that's what those naturalists have said. Francis Crick, you are no more than. Bertrand Russell, you are simply. And that's my question. I struggle to see that. But yes, there are utilitarian accounts of morality which people have used to explain how it's a good idea for us to behave as a society. I think they still should stop short of explaining why moral impossible I think would be the case. I think it would be sad if all the questions are only on this point, because this is my point about these are the kind of things that make me think again about the security of my atheism, rather than here is my case for Christianity. I hope you see it as part of the argument in that kind of way. Disagree with it if you will, but be nice if questions were on the whole thing.
Are there other questions? You've asked, was it? Yeah, up there.
I think you've been a bit intellectually dishonest with the way you put certain views across, just as a comment. I think that you've quoted things and they're quite out of context.
Can you be specific? Because it's not my aim to be.
If you just started again from the beginning, I'm sure that there's quite a few times where I felt angry, and I think that you have misled people, and I think you're doing it.
Okay, that's quite a serious judge. I need you to be specific. So my intention hasn't been to mislead people, and the talk that I've given is available in a published form, and I'd love you to go through and say this quotation is incorrect, because that hasn't been my intention. Okay. And when it's been reviewed by others, they haven't pointed out. So I'm sorry if I have, but I don't know that I haven't. I need you to be specific about where.
Okay, if you tell me where it is, then I'm happy to do that. We didn't actually touch on what the topic I thought was going to be tonight, though, which is why would being atheist make you a worse scientist?
Okay, sure. Well, I'll explain why. I think so. What I'm trying to say today is that the conflict isn't between science and Christianity, but between two worldviews, and those worldviews have to make sense of the data of science. And I think there's a few places where atheism makes a less good account of what we observe than Christianity does. And the two examples I gave today was one, the complexity of, the unlikeliness of this world, and the fine-tuning of the universe, which I think is very consistent with an intention behind it. God wanted it to be this way. And I think that the best guess of the atheist of the multiverse is quite a problematic theory. That's one argument. And the second one was concerning the resurrection of Jesus, where I think atheism has decided in advance of looking at the evidence what the result must be, and I think that's bad science. But it was a question. It was a title that was booked provocatively. So, yes.
Good question up there.
Yeah. Hi. Perhaps I'm being misunderstood the Levi presentation. In terms of following through a particular belief to its logical conclusion. I suppose the question is that as a Christian, not necessarily personally, but how do you reconcile the ultimate question of, right, okay, you've got a creator, who created that creator? It's a self-defeating argument in my head. Because, again, you just can't just prove, create something out of nothing, because something must have created the creator, which, you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I do see that. No, thank you. That's a really good question. So the question is, who created God?
Yeah. And
if I can't answer that, then my theory is found wanting because of that. No, it's a good question, and there's a simple answer, but it's sometimes misunderstood. So let me try and explain it clearly. The Christian view, the Bible's view, is that God is eternal. So he has no beginning, he has no cause, he is before time, outside of time, he's always been, he is the first thing. And eternal things don't need creators. So things that have always been, don't have a beginning, don't have to be explained how they can be, they just are. Only things that start, you have to ask the question, how did they start? And I think that gives actually, this is a different philosophical argument that I haven't used today, but it does again give an answer to my headache, because within modern scientific theory it's agreed that the universe has a beginning. Most people don't think that matter is eternal, but people trace it back to a Big Bang. And then you do have to ask the question, what caused the Big Bang? As a Christian I can say, well, God caused it because he was there before. And to your question of what caused God, I can say nothing caused God because God was eternal. So I have to find something eternal to explain that which has a beginning. But if your view of the world is it's only the stuff that has a beginning, and there's nothing eternal to start it, then you have got a problem. And the way the argument's often put is, it's three propositions. First proposition, everything that begins to exist has a cause. So God doesn't have a cause because God didn't begin to exist, but everything that begins to exist has a cause. Secondly, the universe began to exist. Therefore, thirdly, the universe has to have a cause. And that is a problem for naturalism. How can something that begins begin to begin itself? But I think the Christian who doesn't have a problem on that, because the idea of God is that he doesn't have a start. He's not caused by anything. He's there before anything else.
I think we're going to have time for two brief questions, hopefully, and then we're going to have to call it a day. These two here, I think, and then you first.
You just say about God created the Big Bang, but what if in the future someone can prove that there's something before Big Bang? Then I think the argument would be that Big Bang.
I don't think so, because unless the thing that created the Big Bang is going to be eternal. So if science wants to agree that there is an eternal thing before the Big Bang, then we broadly agree. I'm saying that that's God. But let's just a second, if you said before the Big Bang there was the pre-Big Bang or the pre-Big Bang or something, well, the question still remains, what caused the pre-Big Bang? Because eventually you keep tracing it back and you've got to keep finding explanations until you find something that's eternal.
It's the mission of these science to find the answer for that.
Well, I think it depends. So, it is the mission of the atheist scientists, certainly, because they have a question that they cannot answer, which is a problem. So an atheist scientist would love to have an explanation for the Big Bang that didn't involve God. Of course they would, but they don't have one. And so to say, well, there will be one, is the same as saying, there will be an explanation that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. And, well, we've got to make decisions on the basis of the evidence that there is, rather than the evidence that we think there might be, based on the view that we already hold. So I don't think a reason why the Big Bang happened would be a problem for a Christian, because the question would still be, well, what caused the reason that caused the Big Bang? Unless the reason is an eternal, pre-existent, intentional thing that causes it, which I would say, well, that's exactly what I mean by God, except I'd add that he's personal, which is why the personal comes from the personal rather than the personal arising from the impersonal.
Okay, last question, and then I know I'm aware there'll be more questions. Andrew will be here at least for a little bit of time and he'd be happy to speak to you if that's you who hasn't had your question answered. But that's the last question.
I'd like to focus your challenge. Well, basically, I think certain art will sound one thing, and I, as a materialist, naturalist, make a leap of faith because I have faith in the physicality of the universe. You have faith in a creator, and that should be quite a fair proposition. I agree with a lot of what you said tonight. But you're not a deist. You don't just believe that there is a creator. You don't just believe that there is an intelligence and a meaning for the universe. You're a theist. Even reptilians around here are theists. You believe in an being God, one who listens to my prayers, one who cares when I sleep, but in what way? What I want to ask you is, how can you make that leap from a deist position to a theist position without, and there's only one rule, you're not allowed to use biblical I have noticed that a lot of questions are actually pretty straight from the Bible. The Bible is an extremely
while reading it. You can't ban me for doing something and then say I can't talk about why it's bad.
If you explain how you make that leap without quoting something which essentially requires a big position, which should have a basic scientific discourse.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, Nathan, once again, I'm going to disappoint you. So Nathan's challenge to me is, can I expect, so he's helpfully outlined, I'm saying more than deism is saying. Deism is the philosophy that says there is a God, but he exists only to explain the problem of what started the Big Bang. So it's some first cause, and he sets the universe off, and after that he's not needed anymore. That's deism. And Nathan correctly says that as Christians, the Bible is saying theism, there is a God who is at present involved in sustaining the world, who cares about the world, who's interested in human life, and who interacts with God. That's true. And the challenge that's put to me is, can I give any reasons for theism? But I'm not allowed to use anything in the Bible. That's basically the challenge. And I'm going to disappoint you because I refuse the challenge. And let me say why. Simply because, as I said before, when it comes to getting to know people, scientific method isn't the place we turn. Not because science isn't useful, but because it can't tell you everything that's important. And actually, when it comes to getting to know God, the God who made us, we don't turn to science because you can't do an experiment where God's in your test tube. You can't do that. And actually, if it's just a matter of us here on this planet saying we want to know about the God who's invisible who made us, we can't. It is not accessible to human inquiry in that way. The only way that we could know about the God who made us is if he decided to make himself known. And at the heart of the Christian faith, the Christian claim about the world, is that God has done that in the person of Jesus Christ in history. And the New Testament is, as I said the other day, a collection of all of the relevant eyewitness documents in support of that claim. So to say, can you give me reasons to believe in a God who entered the world in history in the person of Jesus without using any of the evidence about God entering the world in the person of Jesus? No. But I think that's an unfair challenge. I would say, why shouldn't I use the evidence of Jesus in the Bible? Because if I'm right, if Christianity is right, that is the place where God, who made the world, has made himself known. And I'm not prepared to exclude that from the arena. That is where the question, you're absolutely right, that is where the question comes to be resolved. And I'm saying to everyone here, please ask that question. Please try not to occupy a position over here that says, I've already decided that I'm a materialist and it doesn't matter what happened 2,000 years ago, and there's no God, there's no resurrection, because I already know. And try and be open-minded enough to say, maybe that's right. Maybe Andrew's an idiot and he made a mistake and came. It's quite possible. But maybe there is a God who made me. And he made me to know him. And that is more than intellectual games. It really matters. It's what my life is for. And there's a judgment day when I'll face him, as I say, more than that tomorrow. And that he's made that known in a way that can be checked in history, in Jesus Christ. But it does come down to Jesus Christ in history. And a Christian can't honestly answer that question in a way that doesn't involve him. So, sorry, I've gone a long way without answering a question, but sorry about that. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much.